Welcome to the Forge Tutorials Maya Masterclass. In today's video, we're going to talk about the hypergraph. So let's get into it. Now to access the hypergraph, you can go to your Windows menu, to your general editor, and access the hypergraph from here. Now you can see there are two mentions of the hypergraph and the hypergraph connections. We're going to go into the hypergraph connections in a little bit. For now, let's go into the hypergraph hierarchy. When we open the hypergraph hierarchy, you can see it's going to show us these node based view. Now you can move around the hypergraph just as you can move around your viewport. Alt plus drag your middle mouse button to pan inside the hypergraph. You can use your mouse wheel to zoom in and zoom out, and you can use Alt plus right click to zoom in and zoom out as well. By clicking this button in your hypergraph, this will frame everything inside your hypergraph window. And as you can see inside the hypergraph, we have things laid out just as we had in our outliner. We have our hierarchy setup, and you can see how the chain of connection goes inside the hypergraph. We have our group here. You can see the connection here as well. And we have some independent objects right here. Now you can move objects inside the hypergraph just as you can inside the outliner. You just middle click and drag inside the hypergraph. Let's drag and drop this object on top of this object. And you can see now we have created a hierarchy just as we did in the outliner. Let's undo that. Now let's shift click and select multiple objects inside the hypergraph and press Ctrl G to create a group. And as you can see now we have created a group inside the hypergraph. Let's undo that again. And in a bigger scene or when you're rigging, the hypergraph can get a lot more complex. So if you want to focus on a single node, you can click on that node and then click on this button right here that will focus us or frame us on that node. And if you want to only see the things that are connected below that object, click on that object and click on this button right here. That will show us only that part of the hierarchy, only the objects that are connected below that item that we selected. Or you can click on this button. That will show us the complete hierarchy for the object that we have currently selected. Now you can see that the hypergraph right now is very well organized. Now this is the automatic organization. You can also manually organize the hypergraph. If you click on this button right here, you can see the icon has changed. Now you will be able to manually change the position of every node and every connection. And you can also go back and forth between the two views. You can click on this button again and it will give you the automatically organized view. And if you click on this button one more time, it will show you the view that you have created manually. So now that we know the functions and how to navigate within the hypergraph hierarchy window, let's talk about the hypergraph connections window. You can access the hypergraph connections window by clicking on this button, or you can go back to your Windows menu, your general editors, and click on your hypergraph connections. Now when you click on it, you can see that it will show us this window. Right now there is not a lot of stuff in here because we have nothing selected. So let's select our scene and go back to our hypergraph hierarchy. As you can see, it will show us everything that is in our scene and what that thing is connected to in relation to shaders and objects. Let's zoom in a bit. In here you have basically the node based view of your attribute editor. So let's open our attribute editor, and you can see if I select the p-cone shape, it will give us the attributes of the p-cone shape. Or we go to the object as a whole, you can select that as well. It will give you the object's properties, or you can select the shading group it's connected to, and now you have access to that. So the hypergraph connection window is also very helpful. If you want to dig a little more deeper into your object, you can come to the hypergraph connections and look at that. So the hypergraph hierarchy and hypergraph connection, these two windows are really important when you get into rigging any type of stuff. If you want to rig a car, if you want to rig a character, you're going to be spending a lot of time in the hypergraph. So be comfortable with that. It is really not that complicated, and we are going to go a lot deeper into the hypergraph and hypergraph connections when we eventually start rigging characters and small mechanical objects. So this is it for this video. I'm gonna keep this one short, and as always, if you like this video, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, leave a comment, and if you want to support me directly or buy some cool stuff that I made, link to my merch store and my Patreon is in the description down below, and I'll see you in the next video.